Good afternoon. Welcome to Cool Springs. Today is Wednesday, November the 5th, 2025, and this is our series, Heroes and Heroines of the Church. And what I mentioned last week that I've decided to do for the month of November, since we are approaching the season of Thanksgiving in our nation, is I want to make sure that for at least the month of November, the heroes and heroines that we choose to talk about for this series are people who were somehow involved in America's founding, in America's religious heritage as people came to the New World seeking freedom to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. And so today we're looking at a fellow by the name of William Bradford. At the age of 12, he was exposed. He grew up in England, and he was technically a member of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, but he was exposed to some preaching invited by a friend when he was 12 years old to go and hear a separatist minister in England, because there were some Protestants in England who were looking at what the Anglican Church was doing and the doctrines that they were espousing, and they were saying, no, we don't find those in the Bible, or we don't agree with that interpretation, and they wanted the ability to be able to read the Bible for themselves. Remember, this is well before the King James English version is being published, and they wanted to have the right to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. And the Protestant King of England wasn't having any part of that. So there was a lot of back and forth, and as an 18-year-old, Bradford winds up going with some other people who held those separatist type views over to the Netherlands to a place called Scrooby, where they formed a congregation, and ultimately those people are going to get on two ships, one of which is going to have to turn back, and they'll have to add some passengers so that the Mayflower was overcrowded, and they'll make their way to the New World. William Bradford is born in the spring of the year 1590, and he's going to die in the 1660s. So he's coming to the New World in 1620 when he's late 20s, right at 30 years of age. He and his wife Dorothy already had one child, a son named John, who was about 5 years old, and they made the difficult decision to leave their 5-year-old son behind with his maternal grandparents, because he was young and health-wise they didn't think he'd survive the voyage. Ironically, we just have cut one of our other midweek short podcast life lessons about when is it time to stay, when is it time to go. Well, in the case of the Bradford family and the other people who were pilgrims, because they weren't the only ones who had to make this decision, some of them were making the decision to leave for the New World, knowing that the journey was going to be difficult, and knowing that they might have to leave some of their own children behind because they're too young or too weak to be able to survive the voyage. So William and Dorothy Bradford head out for the New World, intending to later on send for their son when they're established, when he's older, when he can safely make the journey, and he will ultimately be able to come to the New World. But for a time, they had to leave him behind with family in England. And when they get to the New World, they have a charter from the King of England that allows them to go and settle in the colony of Virginia. But the borders of the colony of Virginia weren't what they were today when we think of the state of Virginia. They extended all the way up almost to where New York is at. They intended to go to Virginia. They were sailing in the middle of hurricane season in the Atlantic. They started to sail in September of 1620. They had rough sailing. They got off course. Instead of landing anywhere near any of the territory that was considered part of the charter from the king for them to be able to live under the king's permission in the New World. They instead landed in Massachusetts outside of the charter for Virginia. William Bradford is going to be one of the leading men in the group, and he and some of the men will go out from the ship a couple of times on scouting parties where they're looking for a place that they can safely, completely debark the ship, build homes, and start to plant crops and start to have a life. While he's on one of these scouting expeditions, his wife Dorothy accidentally fell off the ship and drowned in the harbor. When they left their 5-year-old son behind with her parents in England, they had hopes and dreams that one day they'd be established enough to where they could send for their child and their family could be reunited. Instead, mother and child will never see each other again. The boy will eventually be able to come over, and William Bradford will be reunited with his son. And he'll remarry and he'll have other children. In fact, some of the descendants of William Bradford include, for example, the actor Clint Eastwood. He is 12 generations from William Bradford, who was one of the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They intended to be in Virginia. They wound up in a different place. They were befriended by a Native American named Squanto, whose tribe had been wiped out, probably accidentally, by exposure to diseases from some of the European traders that had gone back and forth. Squanto had been captured years before and carried to Europe as a slave, but he had been freed by some Catholic monks and managed to work passage to get back to his world, only to discover that his entire village had been wiped out, and he had had to take up residence with a neighboring tribe of people. But because he'd been a slave for a time, he was able to speak fluent English. So when these settlers arrive and they land at a place that they didn't intend to be, and they have a harsh winter, and they're trying to figure out just how to survive until spring, they've got a helper, a native who speaks their language, who can show them what plants are good to eat here, how to hunt for deer, how to catch fish, what crops will work well in this soil, and he's able to help them. In fact, he was absolutely instrumental in their being able to survive that first winter in New England. Many of the Mayflower pilgrims who survived the passage died that first year from the diseases, from the bitter winter that they experienced. But they had another problem. The problem was because they had landed way off course, their charter technically was null and void. It would be like you getting a license or a business license, a driver's license, anything to do business here in Alabama. But you wind up in Louisiana. Your Alabama business license isn't going to do you any good in Louisiana. That was the kind of problem that the Mayflower pilgrims faced, and there was a lot of open talk about, well, since we don't have any governing authority because that charter from the king is no good, everybody can do what's right in their own eyes. We have a biblical example of that. The book of Judges. The people have come into the promised land, and during the lifetime of Joshua and the elders who were around in his generation, they were able to govern themselves. But that generation died out, and the entire book of Judges, the refrain that keeps happening over and over and over again is, now there was no king in those days, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. Well, you fast forward to 1620, 1621, and now the Mayflower pilgrims, who remember came for religious freedom, are about to decide that, okay, there's no law here, so I can do whatever I want, whichever way I want to. It was about to be a recipe for chaos. William Bradford, as one of the leaders of the group, got everybody together and said, no, what we need to do is we need to sit down and come to an agreement on how we're going to govern ourselves for the good of everybody, and we'll all agree that whatever we decide as a group, whatever the majority votes on, we'll all be bound by that. Because he understood the human nature of when I'm free to do whatever I want without any moral guidance whatsoever, freedom becomes license and it turns into wickedness. And so they sat down and they worked it out on the ship, and all of the adult men signed on behalf of themselves and their families the Mayflower Compact. Doesn't get taught in schools and history books like it used to be and like it ought to be, but I happen to have this excellent resource book that I highly recommend you try to get a copy of. America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations by William J. Federer. We had an extra copy that Mark and I purchased, and we placed it in the church library here. And it's got quotes from the actual people and from source documents like state constitutions, Declaration of Independence, all sorts of legal documents that show just how much our national heritage is rooted in the understanding that there is a God who is supreme and that mankind needs to submit himself to God to treat people the way they ought to be treated. So here's the entire text of the Mayflower Compact that they agreed to only after they realized, oops, we're outside of the location where the king had any authority, and so we've got to govern ourselves, and really the only way we can govern ourselves is if we are one people under God. And so here's the text of the Mayflower Compact. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, by ye the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancements of the Christian faith and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Do by these presents, solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue heard to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet for the convenience, for the general good of the colony, under which we promise all the submission and obedience, in witness whereof we have ascribed our names at Cape Cod, 11 November, in the year of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, 18, and by Scotland, year of the 5th, Anno Domini, which means year of our Lord, 1620. So these people realized we can't do our own thing. We have to have a government, and if the charter we brought with us from England is null and void because we're out of the territory that it was supposed to be in, we need to govern ourselves in accordance with our submission to God for our own protection and for the mutual good of our nation. That's part of our real American heritage. Regardless of what's being taught to your kids and your grandkids in schools these days, America was founded as a place where people could worship God according to the dictates of their conscience, but agreed to govern themselves in submission with God's will for the general good of everybody. Thanks for watching.